The neighbors came to check on her in February. Not out of kindness, out of certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from watching someone do something that everyone agrees is wrong. The winter had already taken 3 families off their land. Pipes burst, livestock frozen. 2 men had stripped the wood from their own barn walls just to keep the stove alive through a single night. And she was alone. No husband, no grown sons with an axe. A small claim on the edge of the valley, a modest cabin, and what had appeared, back in October, to be a dangerously thin woodpile stacked against the east wall. The neighbors had seen it. They had talked about it. Some had even offered help in that particular frontier way that was more warning than generosity. She had thanked them and kept digging. That was the part no one understood. While every able hand on the prairie was cutting, splitting, and stacking wood as high and fast as possible, she was digging, moving dirt, going down instead of up. Her neighbors watched with the quiet bewilderment of people who have already decided someone is wrong, but haven't yet seen the consequences. By November, her visible woodpile was gone. By January, her neighbors assumed the worst. By February, when they came to check, her cabin was warm. Not merely survivable. Warm. The kind of steady, settled warmth that takes hours of good, dry fire to build, and days of bad wood to destroy. They stepped inside. They looked at the stove. They looked at the floor. And then one of them asked the question that changed everything. Where is the wood coming from? She smiled and pointed down. What they found beneath that cabin floor was not what anyone expected. It was not luck. It was not mystery. It was something far more unsettling to a community that had spent the whole winter suffering. It was a solution, one that had been right under their feet the entire time. This is the story of what she built, why it worked, and what the rest of the frontier never thought to ask. If you've ever wondered whether the old ways actually knew something we've forgotten, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know where this story finds you. The winter of the late 1880s on the northern Great Plains was not simply cold. It was a different kind of cold, the kind that settlers who had survived previous seasons said they had never felt before and hoped never to feel again. Oral accounts from that era describe it not as a season, but as a force, a presence, something that moved through walls, through wool, through the thinking mind itself. Temperatures dropped below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit for stretches of 2 and 3 weeks without a break. Wind came off the open prairie with nothing to slow it. No mountain range, no forest wall, no ridge of any consequence. Just flat, exposed land and a sky so gray it seemed to press downward like a lid. Local records from several county settlements across the Dakotas and Nebraska describe the period as one of the most sustained cold events in living memory, with some stations recording wind chills that made outdoor work not merely dangerous, but rapidly fatal. The first thing to go was the livestock. Animals that had survived previous winters died in their stalls because their owners could not keep the barn temperatures high enough to prevent hypothermia. Horses, cattle. The smaller animals went first, chickens, pigs, because their enclosures were harder to heat and their bodies had less mass to retain warmth. Families who depended on those animals for both food and income watched them go one by one, sometimes several in a single night. The second thing to go was the wood. This is the detail that most people outside frontier history fail to appreciate. Firewood was not simply a comfort in those conditions. It was the difference between life and death measured in hours. A family that ran out of wood in February, on the open plains with the nearest town a day's ride away under good conditions and unreachable under bad ones. That family was in genuine danger. Not metaphorical danger. Not the kind of danger that resolves itself by morning. The kind that required neighbors to intervene, or it didn't resolve at all. The standard method of storing firewood across most Great Plains settlements was straightforward and, in most years, adequate. Settlers cut and split wood through the late summer and early fall, stacking it in cords against the exterior wall of the cabin or in a separate woodshed if they had the lumber and labor to build one. A cord of dry hardwood, measuring 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, weighed somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds depending on the species, and a well-insulated frontier cabin might burn through 2 to 3 cords in a hard winter. Families who could afford it stacked 4. Those who couldn't hope the winter would be mild. It was not mild. What made this particular winter so destructive to wood supplies was not just the volume of fuel required to stay warm. It was the moisture. Heavy early snowfall buried ground-level woodpiles before they were fully seasoned. Snow packed into the spaces between split logs and melted slightly during the warmer parts of the day, then refroze overnight. By January, many families were not burning dry cordwood. They were burning partially frozen, moisture-saturated logs that hissed, steamed, and produced perhaps 40% to 50% of the heat output they would have generated if properly dried. Wet wood burns at significantly lower temperatures than dry wood. A well-seasoned hardwood log, with a moisture content below 20%, can produce upward of 8,000 BTUs per pound when fully combusted. The same log, saturated to 40% or 50% moisture content, may yield fewer than 5,000 BTUs per pound, because a substantial portion of the fire's energy is consumed simply boiling off the water before any real combustion can begin. The difference is not academic. It is the difference between a cabin that holds at 55 degrees Fahrenheit through the night and one that drops to 35 degrees Fahrenheit by morning. Families begin burning things they had never intended as fuel. Furniture, interior partition walls, the wooden handles of tools. One local account from a settlement near the Missouri River describes a family that dismantled their front porch entirely over the course of a single week, feeding it board by board into the stove to survive until the weather broke. By February, the community in the valley had collectively lost a third of its winter wood supply. Not because they hadn't cut enough in the fall, but because what they had cut was no longer dry enough to burn efficiently. The wood was there. It simply wasn't doing its job anymore. And yet, at the edge of the valley, one small cabin held steady. No one had paid close attention yet. They were too busy with their own emergencies. But the warmth coming from that cabin, visible in the lack of desperation, in the unhurried rhythm of daily life inside it, would not stay unnoticed for long. Her name, according to oral tradition passed down through families in the region, was something like Marin, though the spelling and origin varied, depending on who was telling the story, which itself says something about how history treats the women of the frontier. She was not famous. She was not documented in any territorial survey or land office record that has survived in easily searchable form. What is known about her comes through the kind of evidence that historians sometimes call soft. Neighbors who remembered, descendants who repeated a sentence here and there in the letters of people who knew her by sight, if not by name. What those accounts agree on is this. She was a widow, probably in her early 40s, who had come to the valley with her husband sometime in the late 1870s. Her husband had died. The cause varies by account, ranging from illness to a farming accident, leaving her with the claim, the cabin, and the problem of surviving on land that required constant, physical, exhausting labor from people in good health and reasonable numbers. She had neither the family labor pool nor the physical brute strength that frontier homesteading typically demanded. She was, by every external measure, exactly the kind of person the frontier was not designed to favor. The homesteading system of the Northern Plains was built around assumptions that a family would have adult men capable of heavy timber work, that the household would generate enough surplus in good seasons to absorb the losses of bad ones, that there would be neighbors close enough and willing enough to provide emergency assistance. For widows alone on a claim, those assumptions broke down quickly. Some returned east. Some remarried out of practical necessity. A few, a stubborn, particular few, found ways to work within their constraints that their more conventionally equipped neighbors had never needed to discover. Marin, by all available indication, was one of that last group. Those who knew her described a woman who was observant in a way that struck people as unusual. Not scholarly, she had no formal education beyond what the frontier commonly offered, which was limited but attentive. She noticed things, how the snow accumulated differently on different sides of the valley, how the ground temperature changed with depth, how the root cellar she used for food storage stayed at a remarkably consistent temperature even through the worst weeks of winter, cold enough to preserve, never cold enough to freeze, never warm enough to spoil. She had kept a root cellar for years and understood, in the practical way that comes from daily observation rather than formal study, what the earth beneath the frost line actually did. She had also grown up, before coming west, in a community of Scandinavian immigrants. And this, the oral accounts suggest, may be where the key piece of knowledge originated. In parts of Norway, Sweden, and Finland, the practice of storing firewood in partially or fully buried log caches was not uncommon in regions where open-air stacking was vulnerable to the particular cruelty of wet maritime snow. These were not elaborate structures, often just a pit lined with stones or logs, covered with a roof of timber and sod, ventilated just enough to allow the wood inside to breathe without letting in precipitation. The technique did not require a name to be useful. It was simply what some families did and had done for generations, and Maren had seen it done as a child without necessarily understanding the physics behind it. She understood the result, though. Wood stored underground, below the frost line, below the reach of freeze-thaw cycles and driving snow, stay dry. It didn't gain heat. It didn't cure faster, but it held what it had, and in the conditions of a Great Plains winter, holding what you had was everything. Where her husband died, she had been left with a claim she couldn't abandon and a winter that would not negotiate. She had looked at her situation with the particular clarity that scarcity provides, and she had made a decision. She would go down. She started digging in September when the ground was still workable. The neighbors noticed, because on the open plains you notice everything your neighbors do. There's simply too much sky and too little else to look at. At first, the general assumption was that she was expanding her root cellar. That made sense. A woman alone, preparing for winter, increasing her food storage capacity. Reasonable. Practical. No one would comment on that. But the hole grew too large for food storage. And she wasn't positioning it the way you'd position a root cellar, tucked into a hillside or dug adjacent to the cabin for easy access to the kitchen. She was digging directly beneath and beside the cabin's east wall, in a configuration that puzzled the few who walked close enough to look. The excavation was wide enough, one account suggests, to stack split logs 4 feet high in rows, with narrow aisles between them for pulling wood out from either side. That was when the comments started. The frontier was not a cruel community in the way that phrase is sometimes understood. It was not mean-spirited or malicious. But it was a community built on practical consensus, and practical consensus had a strong immune response to ideas that deviated from established method. If everyone stored wood above ground, and everyone had survived previous winters doing so, then the burden of proof fell entirely on the person doing something different. And the person doing something different here was a widow, alone, without the social capital that came from being a man with a track record of successful seasons. The comments were gentle in form. They always are. That's a lot of work for nothing. What'll rot down there? You're going to lose everything you put in. One neighbor, a man named Clifford who ran cattle on the adjacent claim, reportedly told her directly that she was making a mistake, that the ground moisture would ruin the wood before February, and that she'd be better off cutting more and stacking it properly, the way everyone else did. She listened to Clifford. She thanked him for his concern, and she kept digging. The logic of the critics was not unreasonable on its surface. Wood does rot. Moisture is wood's enemy when it comes to burning efficiency, and the soil of the northern plains holds considerable moisture, particularly in the upper layers where plant roots compete and rain accumulates through the warmer months. Anyone who had left a log in contact with wet ground for a season knew what happened to it. The bark loosened, the end grain darkened, the wood softened, and eventually crumbled. Putting your entire winter fuel supply underground seemed to invite exactly that process on a catastrophic scale. What Clifford and the others were not accounting for, what they had no particular reason to account for, because they had never needed to, was the difference between surface moisture and subsurface moisture. Between the dynamic, variable, freeze-thaw zone that extends roughly 3 to 4 feet below the surface on the northern plains and the stable, relatively dry equilibrium that exists below it. They were thinking of what left on the ground. She was thinking of something else entirely. The dig took her the better part of 6 weeks, working in the early morning and late afternoon to avoid the worst of the autumn heat. She moved the excavated soil carefully, spreading it far enough from the site that it wouldn't be washed back by rain. She was not a fast digger. She was one person with a spade and a determination that seems, in retrospect, almost unreasonable in its steadiness. But by mid-October, the hole was ready. By late October, it was full of wood. By early November, it was sealed. And by the time the first serious snow came, the wet, heavy, packing snow that buried the valley's conventional woodpiles under a foot of ice-crusted white, her fuel supply was completely invisible. Protected. Waiting. Her neighbors looked at her thin, exterior woodpile against the east wall and shook their heads. They had tried to warn her. Some of them genuinely felt sorry for what they assumed was coming. The winter had barely started. There is a line in the ground that most people never think about. It has a name, the frost line, sometimes called the frost depth, and on the northern Great Plains in the late 19th century, it sat somewhere between 36 and 48 inches below the surface, depending on the specific location, the density of the snow cover above it, and how brutal the particular winter happened to be. Above that line, the ground participated in the same punishing cycle as everything else in a plains winter. It froze hard, cracked, thawed during the occasional warmer afternoon, refroze at night, absorbed meltwater, and expanded again. That cycle, repeated dozens of times between November and March, was what split fence posts, heaved stone foundations, and rotted the end grain of any wood left in contact with the surface soil. Below that line, the earth did something different. It held still, not warm. The soil below the frost line on the northern plains of February is cold, somewhere in the range of 32 degrees Fahrenheit to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on depth and location. But it is consistently cold. It does not swing. It does not oscillate between freezing and thawing. It does not accumulate liquid moisture the way surface soil does during melt cycles, because it is too cold for liquid water to migrate downward from above and too stable for the temperature fluctuations that drive moisture movement. It is, in the language of building science, a buffer zone, not warm enough to be comfortable, but stable enough to be useful. Maren had not read building science, but she had spent years watching her root cellar. Root cellars were common on the frontier, necessary, in fact, for anyone who wanted to preserve vegetables, dairy, and cured meats through a winter without mechanical refrigeration. The principle was simple: dig deep enough to get below the freeze-thaw zone, line the walls and floor to manage moisture, and let the earth itself regulate the temperature. A well-built root cellar on the Great Plains maintained an interior temperature between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cold enough to slow bacterial growth and preserve food, stable enough to prevent freezing. Settlers who had good root cellars understood intuitively that the ground, at depth, was not the enemy of preservation. It was the mechanism of it. What Maren appears to have recognized, and what her critics had not connected, was that the same principle applied to firewood. The enemy of stored firewood is not cold. Cold wood burns perfectly well. Anyone who has brought a log in from a cold woodshed knows that it lights and burns without issue once the fire is going. The true enemy of stored firewood is moisture content. Specifically, the repeated wetting and partial drying that happens when wood is exposed to precipitation, snow melt, and freeze-thaw cycles of the surface. Each cycle drives moisture deeper into the wood's cellular structure. Each cycle of partial drying followed by re-wetting prevents the wood from ever reaching the seasoned state, below 20% moisture content, where it burns at peak efficiency. Wood stored below the frost line, in a structure designed to manage drainage and airflow, does not experience those cycles. It sits at a stable, cold temperature. It neither gains moisture nor loses it rapidly. If it was dry when it went in, or even partially seasoned, it stays at roughly that level of dryness through the entire winter. It does not improve significantly, but crucially, it does not deteriorate. The Scandinavian communities that Maren came from had developed variations of this approach over centuries, adapted to a climate that shared important characteristics with the northern plains: heavy wet snow, prolonged freezing temperatures, and the particular problem of wood that looked dry on the outside, but had been infiltrated by moisture in ways that only became apparent when you try to burn it. Oral accounts from immigrant communities in Minnesota and the Dakotas describe partially buried log caches, sometimes called vedliger in Norwegian, roughly translating to wood storage, as a technique carried from the old country and adapted to new conditions. They were not universal, and they were not well documented in English-language frontier records, which is one reason the practice faded from common memory even among communities that had once relied on it. Maren knew the principle. She had the land, the time, and the pressing necessity to apply it. What she lacked, and what made her situation unusual, was the luxury of skepticism. She could not afford to store wood the conventional way and hope for the best. She had looked at her situation clearly, calculated what she had and what she needed, and arrived at the only solution that made the math work. The underground room was not an experiment. It was a conclusion. The structure she built was not large by any architectural standard, but it was precise in the ways that mattered. She began with the excavation itself. Approximately 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 5 feet deep, dug with a flat spade and a pickaxe into the dense clay loam soil that characterizes much of the northern plains subsoil. That depth placed the floor of the structure roughly 18 to 24 inches below the local frost line, inside the stable zone, past the reach of the worst freeze-thaw cycling. The total excavated volume was somewhere in the range of 480 cubic feet, which sounds substantial until you realize that a single woman accomplished it over 6 weeks of early morning and late afternoon work, moving the spoil soil far enough from the site to prevent rain from washing it back. Drainage was the first problem she solved, and she solved it the way most frontier builders solve problems they couldn't afford to get wrong, with gravel and slope. The floor of the excavation was not flat. She cut it with a slight pitch. Oral accounts suggest roughly 2 inches of fall across the 12-foot length, directing any water that infiltrated the structure toward a small sump at the far end, a deeper pocket in the floor filled with coarse gravel that allowed liquid water to percolate away rather than pooling under the woodpile. Above the gravel floor, she laid a course of flat field stones, the kind of dense, low porosity stones common to the glacial till of the plains, creating a platform that kept the bottom layer of wood off the ground entirely. Air could circulate beneath the lowest logs. Moisture that did enter the structure as vapor had somewhere to go before it reached the wood. The walls came next. She did not attempt to build masonry walls. That would have required more material and more time than she had. Instead, she used a technique borrowed directly from the root cellar tradition. She cut and fitted short horizontal log sections, split halves of the same cordwood she was ultimately storing, directly against the excavation walls, creating a rough timber lining that held the soil back, allowed some air circulation between the earthen wall and the stored wood, and provided a surface that managed moisture absorption better than bare soil pressed against the logs she needed to keep dry. The timber lining was not permanent. It would decay over years, but it didn't need to be permanent. It needed to last one winter. The roof presented the most significant engineering challenge, and here Maren's solution was characteristically practical. She built a low, sloped frame of rough-cut timber, salvaged from material she had on hand rather than purchased, that extended from just below grade level on the cabin side to roughly 18 inches above grade on the outer side. The slope served 2 purposes. It shed snow and rain away from the entrance rather than allowing accumulation directly above the stored wood, and it created a slight convective draw that helped manage the humidity inside the structure. Over the timber frame, she laid a thick layer of prairie sod, cut in blocks and stacked 2 layers deep, which acted as both insulation and waterproofing. Sod roofing was well understood on the plains. Settlers have been building sod houses with it for decades, and its thermal and moisture-shedding properties were practically tested and widely trusted. The entrance was a hatch, a simple framed opening, approximately 30 inches wide and 36 inches tall, fitted with a door of rough boards sealed at the edges with strips of burlap soaked in pine pitch. The hatch faced south, away from the prevailing north and northwest winds, and was positioned so that the cabin's east wall partially sheltered it from direct snow accumulation. Opening the hatch required brushing away whatever snow had drifted against it, descending 3 shallow steps cut into the earth, and retrieving the day's wood by hand. She could do that alone. She had designed it so that she could. The ventilation was the detail that most distinguished her structure from a simple pit. Along the upper edge of the outer wall, she left a narrow gap, perhaps 3 inches between the top of the timber lining and the underside of the sod roof, screened loosely with woven grass to keep rodents out while allowing air to move slowly through the stored wood. This passive airflow, cold, dry air drawn in at one level and expelled at another through the slight temperature differential between the interior of the structure and the outside, was not aggressive enough to cool the wood significantly. But it was enough to prevent the stagnant humidity that would have built up in a completely sealed space and begun, over weeks, to re-wet the outer surfaces of the stacked logs. She loaded the structure with between 2.5 and 3 cords of split wood, primarily cottonwood and some elm, the species most available to a Great Plains settler without access to large stands of harder northern timber. Neither species is the ideal heating wood. Cottonwood in particular has a relatively low density and burns faster than oak or hickory, requiring more volume to produce equivalent heat. But dry cottonwood burns cleanly and hot enough for a well-managed stove, and Marin had enough of it to last the winter if she was careful with the fire. By the time she sealed the hatch in late October, the underground room held everything she needed to survive until April. She covered the hatch with a final layer of sod and scattered a thin covering of loose soil over the disturbed ground. Within 2 weeks, blowing prairie grass and the first light snow had made the site nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Her neighbors saw the small exterior woodpile against the east wall and assumed that was all she had. They were looking in exactly the wrong direction. The first serious storm of that winter arrived in mid-November, earlier than most settlers had expected and heavier than the previous 2 seasons had prepared them for. It came from the northwest, as the worst plains storms usually do, a wall of gray-white that flattened the dry grass and dropped visibility to near zero within the first hour. The temperature fell from a mid-20s degree F to single digits in less than 6 hours, a drop of 15 to 20 degrees in an afternoon, and the wind drove the snow horizontally, packing it against every vertical surface with a force that made the usual methods of judging snowfall depth meaningless. By the time the storm had run its course, 2 days later, the valley floor had between 18 and 24 inches of consolidated snowpack, with drifts against north-facing walls and fences reaching 4 and 5 feet. The community's woodpiles disappeared under that first storm. Not entirely. The wood was still there, buried, but accessing it required digging, and the snow that had packed into the spaces between split logs during the storm had already begun the process that would compromise fuel quality for the rest of the winter. Settlers who went out to retrieve, with the morning after the storm broke, found that the top and outer layers of their piles were sodden. Some of it was frozen solid, logs locked together by ice that had formed in the narrow gaps and crevices between them, requiring a pry bar or an axe just to separate individual pieces. The wood that came loose was cold and wet and would need to be brought inside and dried for hours before it would burn well. In the meantime, families were burning their dry indoor reserves. The small quantity of seasoned wood most settlers kept stacked inside the cabin itself for immediate use. That reserve was never meant to carry a household through more than a day or 2. By the morning after the storm, households across the valley were discovering how quickly good wood disappeared when wet wood from outside was throwing half its energy into steam instead of heat. At Marin's cabin, the morning after the storm was quieter. She rose before first light, as she always did, dressed in the full layering that winter demanded, and went to the cabin's east wall. The hatch was drifted over with perhaps 8 inches of packed snow. She cleared it with a short-handled wooden paddle she kept inside specifically for that purpose, lifted the hatch, and descended the 3 earthen steps in the underground room. The temperature inside was approximately 34 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the outdoor air by nearly 20 degrees, because the surrounding earth, buffered by the sod roof and the insulating mass of soil on all sides, had not experienced the same rapid temperature drop as the surface. The wood was exactly as she had left it in October. Dry, solid. The split faces of the cottonwood logs showed the pale, clean grain of properly seasoned timber, without the darkening or softness that wet wood develops at its exposed surfaces. She carried out 4 logs, came back for 4 more, loaded the stove with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for years, because she had been, just not with wood this dry. The fire caught quickly, the draft was clean, and within 40 minutes the cabin interior had risen to a comfortable working temperature. She made breakfast. She did her morning chores. She checked her animals. The logs she burned that morning produced clean, even heat, the kind of combustion that a well-seasoned, low-moisture content wood delivers when it has not been compromised by repeated wetting. A dry cottonwood log at roughly 15% to 18% moisture content burns at a firebox temperature somewhere between 900 degrees Fahrenheit and 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit under good draft conditions, producing heat steadily for 40 to 60 minutes per log of standard splitting size. Wet wood from a neighbor's compromised piles, by contrast, was burning at lower firebox temperatures. Some accounts suggest the fires were difficult to maintain at all without constant attention, because the moisture content was driving the effective combustion temperature down and producing more smoke than heat. She needed fewer logs to achieve the same warmth. The fire burned longer between loadings. The stove's thermal mass, its cast iron walls, and the surrounding stone hearth had enough consistent heat to absorb and radiate it back into the room through the night. One neighbor, Clifford, the same man who had warned her about the wood rotting underground, passed her cabin that afternoon on his way to check a fence line. He noticed the smoke from her chimney. Steady, pale gray, the clean exhaust of dry wood burning efficiently. He noticed that she did not look distressed. He noticed that her exterior woodpile, still thin, still exposed, still apparently inadequate, had not visibly changed overnight. He did not stop to ask questions that day, but he noticed. January came without apology. The second major storm of that winter arrived in the first week of the new year and proved to be a different kind of event than November's opening blow. That first storm had been violent but brief. 2 days of fury followed by a week of cold, clear air in which settlers could at least move, repair, and restock. January's storm was slower and more patient. It did not arrive all at once. It settled in. Gray skies that dropped temperature steadily for 4 days before the snowfall even began, followed by 8 days of intermittent snow, wind, and temperatures that rarely climbed above 5 degrees Fahrenheit and dropped, on the worst nights, to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit and lower. By the end of that second week, the valley was not merely cold. It was sealed. Travel between homesteads became dangerous enough that most families stopped attempting it. The road, such as it was, a pair of wagon tracks pressed into the prairie, disappeared entirely under drifts that reached 6 feet in the low spots between claims. Anyone who needed to move between properties did so on foot, reading the landscape by memory rather than by sight, carrying whatever they were bringing in a pack against their body to keep it from freezing. The community's firewood crisis, which had been manageable after November's storm, became acute. The problem was not simply volume anymore. It was quality. The woodpiles that had survived November had been repeatedly wetted and partially frozen through December's lighter weather, and by January they had reached a state that experienced frontier settlers described as punky, a term for wood whose cellular structure had been compromised enough by moisture infiltration in the early stages of decay that it no longer burned with real authority. Punky wood lights reluctantly, produces a low, smoky flame, generates significant creosote in the flue, and delivers perhaps 50% to 60% of the heat output of properly seasoned wood of the same species. Families were burning twice as much volume to produce the same heat, and they were running out. Clifford's household was among those feeling the pressure most acutely. He had stacked what he considered a generous supply in October, nearly 4 cords, enough for a normal winter with a comfortable margin. By mid-January, he had burned through more than 3 of those cords and was rationing the remainder carefully, keeping the cabin at temperatures that were survivable but not comfortable. His wife kept the family close to the stove during the day. At night, they slept under every blanket they owned and woke to interior temperatures that hovered, on the worst mornings, between 38 degrees Fahrenheit and 42 degrees Fahrenheit. He was not alone in that experience. Oral accounts from the period describe household after household managing the same slow, grinding depletion. The calculation each evening of how many logs remained, how many days of winter likely remained, and whether those two numbers were going to reconcile. Marin's cabin, by contrast, held at a consistent interior temperature of between 58 degrees Fahrenheit and 65 degrees Fahrenheit through the worst of January's cold. That figure requires some context. A frontier cabin of her size, roughly 16 by 20 feet of interior space, with log walls averaging 8 inches of diameter and a sodden earth roof, was not a thermally efficient structure by any modern standard. Heat loss through the walls, floor, and roof was substantial. But dry cottonwood, burned in a well-managed cast-iron stove with a properly functioning draft, produces enough sustained radiant heat to maintain those temperatures in a cabin of that size, even at outdoor temperatures of minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, provided the fire is loaded correctly and the wood is genuinely dry. The wood in Marin's underground room was genuinely dry. She had measured her burning rate carefully through November and December, and by January, she knew her supply was not only adequate, it was ahead of where she had projected. The stable underground temperature had preserved the wood's moisture content at the level it had when she stored it, roughly 18% to 22%, which is at the lower end of the range considered acceptably seasoned for efficient combustion. She had not lost wood to rot. She had not lost wood to moisture infiltration. She had lost nothing to the freeze-thaw cycles that had systematically destroyed the quality of her neighbor's fuel supplies. What she had stored was still there, intact, burning the way wood is supposed to burn. She loaded the stove twice daily, once in the early morning and once in the late afternoon, using between 6 and 8 split logs per loading. The fire ran hot enough that the cast-iron surface of the stove reached temperatures between 400 degrees Fahrenheit and 500 degrees Fahrenheit at its peak, radiating heat into the cabin's relatively small interior, with an efficiency that surprised even people who understood stove physics. The stone hearth surrounding the stove base absorbed heat during the burn cycle and released it slowly for hours afterward, functioning as a modest but meaningful thermal mass buffer that kept the interior temperature from crashing between firings. By the third week of January, the smoke from her chimney had become something that neighbors talked about. Not because it was unusual to see smoke, because it was unusual to see that particular quality of smoke, thin, pale, consistent, coming from a cabin that everyone had written off as underprepared before winter had even started. It was Clifford who came first. He arrived on foot on a Tuesday morning in the third week of January, his coat frosted at the collar from the half-mile walk between claims. He came, he would later say, to check on her, which was true in part. He was also running low enough on usable wood that the thought had occurred to him, more than once in recent days, that he might need to ask for some. He had not quite admitted that to himself, yet when he knocked, she opened the door. The warmth that came through it was immediate and startling. Not the thin, uncertain warmth of a fire being carefully rationed, but the deep, settled warmth of a space that had been consistently heated for weeks by a stove burning good, dry fuel. He stepped inside without being invited, the way people do when cold has made them honest about what they need. He looked at the stove. He looked at the small stack of logs beside it, perhaps a day's worth of wood, neatly split. He looked at the floor. Where's the rest of it? She showed him. She took him to the east wall, cleared the drift from the hatch with the short-handled paddle, and lifted the door. He went down the 3 earthen steps and stood in the underground room for a long moment without speaking. The smell was the first thing that registered. Not rot, not mildew, not the damp earth smell he had expected. It smelled of wood, dry wood, the clean, faint sweetness of cottonwood and elm that has been stored properly, undisturbed, through months of winter. He reached out and picked up a log from the nearest row. It was light in his hands, lighter than the half-frozen, moisture-saturated wood he had been wrestling from his own pile for weeks. He knocked it against the stone wall of the structure, the way experienced woodcutters do to test moisture content by sound. It rang, solid and bright, the sound of wood with most of its moisture already out. He set it back without saying anything for another long moment. Then, how much do you have? She had at that point approximately 1.5 cords remaining, enough to carry her through to April with careful management. She offered him a 1/4 cord. He accepted. He carried it back to his cabin in 2 trips, loading it into a canvas sling he had brought, and his wife later told a neighbor that the difference in their stove's performance that night was immediately noticeable. The fire ran hotter. It needed less wood to maintain temperature. The cabin reached a warmth by early evening that they hadn't felt since November. Word moved through the valley the way word always moves in small, isolated communities, faster than anyone plans and with details that grow or shift into retelling. By the end of that week, 4 other families had come to see the underground room. 2 of them accepted wood. The others came primarily to understand what they were looking at, to stand in the excavation and look at the rows of stacked logs and reconcile what they saw with what they had assumed about the winter. The questions they asked were practical ones. How deep did she dig? How did she keep the water out? How did she prevent the wood from rotting? What did the roof cost? Could it be built after the ground froze? Or did it have to be done in fall? She answered every question. She had no reason not to. What struck the visitors most, by most accounts, was not the sophistication of the structure. It was the simplicity of it. There was no mechanism they couldn't understand, no material they couldn't source, no technique that required skills beyond what any settler already had. It was a hole in the ground, lined with stone and timber, covered with sod, ventilated just enough to breathe. The genius of it, if genius is the right word for something that several Northern European cultures had been doing for generations, was not in its complexity. It was in the decision to do it at all, made by someone who had thought carefully about a problem that everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. Clifford, walking back to his claim that January afternoon with a sling of dry wood over his shoulder, said something that was remembered and repeated by at least 2 people who were present. He said it quietly, not quite to anyone in particular, in a way that people speak when they're processing something they're not entirely comfortable with. I told her that it would rot. He paused. It didn't rot. Spring came to the valley in April, as it always did, slowly at first, then with the sudden conviction of a season that has been waiting a long time. The snowpack retreated from the south-facing slopes before the north-facing ones. The frozen ground thawed from the surface down, turning the tracks between homesteads into a particular kind of mud that frontier settlers called gumbo, heavy, adhesive, and exhausting. The worst of the winter was over. The community emerged from it changed in the way that hard winters change communities, with a clearer understanding of what had worked and what hadn't, and with the specific practical knowledge that comes from having survived something difficult rather than simply having read about it. Marin's underground wood store was part of that knowledge now. It had not remained a secret after January, and she had not tried to keep it one. By the time the snow melted that spring, at least 3 families in the valley had already begun planning their own versions of the structure for the following fall. 2 of them consulted her directly. One of those consultations, according to a descendant's account collected decades later, lasted most of an afternoon. She walked through every decision she had made in the construction, from the depth of the excavation to the placement of the sump, and answered questions with the patience of someone who had thought carefully about each element and was pleased to see that thinking recognized as worth sharing. The replications were not identical to her original. They never are, when knowledge moves through practice rather than through written instruction. Some families went deeper. Some used more stone in the flooring. One family on the north end of the valley built their version partially into a natural hillside, which shortened the excavation work considerably and added an additional layer of earth insulation on 3 sides. Each variation was an adaptation, the same underlying principle applied to a different set of constraints and resources. That is how vernacular engineering works. It does not travel as a blueprint. It travels as an idea, modified at each transfer by the intelligence and necessity of the person receiving it. What the frontier gave up over the following generations was largely the necessity that drives that kind of adaptation. By the early 20th century, the infrastructure of the northern plains had changed enough that the conditions which had made Marin solution essential were becoming rarer. Rail lines brought coal to communities that had previously depended entirely on local wood. Mechanized timber operations produced more consistent and better seasoned commercial firewood. Covered woodsheds, which any family with access to milled lumber could build quickly, addressed the most immediate problem of precipitation and moisture infiltration without requiring the labor of excavation. The underground wood store did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because the particular combination of poverty, isolation, and necessity that had made it optimal became less common. But the physics did not change. Drywood still burns between 25% and 40% more efficiently than wet wood of the same species. The frost line still sits at 36 to 48 inches on the northern plains. The earth below it still maintains a stable, cold temperature through the entire winter, undisturbed by the freeze-thaw cycling that damages surface-stored materials. A structure built below that line, with adequate drainage and passive ventilation, will still preserve firewood in essentially the same condition it was stored, because none of the forces that degrade surface-stored wood can reach it there. Modern off-grid homesteaders and rural households who have rediscovered the principle often report the same surprise that Clifford felt standing in that underground room in January. Not at the sophistication of the technique, but at the simplicity of it. The materials are basic. The labor is real, but achievable. The performance is reliable in a way that tarps, woodsheds, and covered racks, which all allow some degree of freeze-thaw, cycling, and moisture infiltration, cannot match in the most extreme conditions. What Marin understood was not a secret in any mystical sense. It was not lost knowledge waiting to be rediscovered by someone with access to the right library. It was practical knowledge, the kind that lives in the hands and the memory of people who have needed it, and fades when the need fades, and returns when the need returns. She had needed it. She had applied it. And she had survived a winter that broke the assumptions of everyone around her. Not because she was exceptional in any dramatic sense, but because she had paid attention to what the earth was already doing and had been willing to trust what she observed over what everyone told her was obvious. The underground room stayed in use for 11 more winters by oral account. The sod roof was repaired twice. The timber lining was replaced once in the 4th year. The stone floor never needed attention at all. It worked because it was built to work, and because the woman who built it had understood, before the first shovel went into the ground, that the difference between surviving and not surviving that winter was not going to be found in doing more of what everyone else was doing. It was going to be found in going deeper. If this story made you think differently about what the old ways actually knew, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're building something off-grid, or just thinking about it, tell us in the comments. We read everyone. This screenplay is intended for educational and historical storytelling purposes only. It does not substitute for professional engineering or construction guidance.